Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's February 19, 2021, and today we are talking with Dr. David Brenner, lecturer at the Department of International Relations at the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex in the UK. Hi, David.
Hi, Luke. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Your book, Rebel Politics, A Political Sociology of Armed Struggle in Myanmar's Borderlands, published in 2019 with Cornell University Press, looks inside two of Myanmar's most intractable political and armed conflicts, fought on mostly ethnic and nationalist lines and oscillating back and forth between ceasefires and violence. These broadly, to introduce them, are the conflicts between the Burmese army, the Tatmadaw, and the Kachin Independence Organisation and their army, the KIA, and between the Tatmadaw and the Karen National Union and their Liberation Army, the KNLA. You argue against simplifications about unitary actors and say that the co-optation of these groups' leadership has been central to the Tatmadaw's counterinsurgency strategy for nearly 30 years. Now, at a time when hopes were really running high that increasing levels of civilian participation in national politics in Myanmar was slowly institutionalizing democracy, you published this book with a bit of a grave forewarning. You wrote in 2019, "The political situation in Myanmar is unfortunately still too unstable, insecure, authoritarian, and unpredictable to mention the names of the people at the very centre of this book." And you wrote that ethnic conflict has not ended since State Councillor Daw Aung San Suu Kyi came to power. In fact, it has escalated. So, we all woke up on February 1st, 2021, to the news that the political sands were shifting once again in the heartland of Myanmar. Indeed, this was something like an entire sand dune coming down in an avalanche. So, David, after this lengthy introduction, as someone who focuses on the politics of peace and the EAO's, ethnic armed organisations, what happened on February 1 in your own words and analysis, and what does it mean?
Yeah, Luke, thanks for this excellent introduction. You're already foregrounding a lot of the fragmented complexities in the politics of Myanmar. On February the 1st, I was as surprised as everyone else, to be honest, in terms of that there was a coup actually unfolding, despite the forewarnings of the army, etc., and despite quite clearly me not being always that optimistic about transition, etc., as some other observers have been for the last decade. You know? I also did not quite believe that the army necessarily needed to take power in a coup to fortify further its power and its status and its kind of access to resources and revenues, etc., in the country, right? That nevertheless, I was actually thinking back to 2011, 2012, when I kind of first came into this country at an interesting time of, well, this transition. That transition that looked so much like democratization from the outside, that looked so much like opening up and liberalization in all forms and shapes. And certainly it has been an incredible transition over the last decade. But when I came to Myanmar at that time, I was basically very privileged to come not to Yangon or Mandalay and study, say, the NLD and civil military relations, but really to access the country through the Karen and Kachin communities in the Thai and the Chinese border areas. And that was very enlightening at the time already because, well, many of those people were not quite as optimistic and were rather cautious indeed about what's unfolding, despite Obama coming and shaking hands with, Aung San Suu Kyi at a later point then, etc. So here, I think on February the 1st, I was thinking back a lot to many of my interlocutors from that time as well. And indeed called some of them. And, we know how difficult it's been with internet access in Myanmar now and reaching people, etc. But I've been also reaching out and managed to also reach some old friends whom I've been having very, enlightening conversations since these times of 2011 and 2012. And it really seemed that even though they were also surprised of the, maybe exact timing now that the military is taking over, etc. Everybody had to do, a little bit of like sorting out and tea leaves reading, etc. Of course, but I think very strikingly, people there were much less shocked about what is happening, than maybe many communities in Yangon or in Mandalay, of course, And part of the reason for that, of course, is that the last decade of transition has worked very differently in those border areas and has not translated to the same stability and hope that it has necessarily in other places. And we can talk further about that because obviously it's complex, and I'm not saying that there haven't been any changes in places like Myitkyina or Pa'an, right? There have been striking and remarkable changes indeed. But of course, we have to, I think, focus here particular on kind of differentiating between different ethnic minority communities as well, even within the Kachin or the Karen populations, right? Where they live, how they're being caught up by conflict, etc. But we can all do all of that, of course, throughout the episode today. Yeah?
So one assumes that if the status quo or something similar to it endures with a military government for at least the next year, the status and importance of the previously incumbent civilian party, the National League for Democracy, and any other political party in peace negotiations will simply not exist. So what has it been like for the past decade in these EAOs and with their negotiations with not only their previous foe, the Tatmadaw, but also the civilian government? Your research really focuses in on the inside of these movements and various different opinions within them and struggles for legitimacy. So do you think that this will simplify or complicate peace negotiations in the future?
I believe it will clearly simplify some of the negotiation dynamics. Whether or not that is for the better in terms of the outcome is, of course, to be questioned, right? So the negotiations between EAOs and the authorities, which now clearly are the Tatmadaw only again, will be simplified purely through the fact that EAOs have a very clear other to speak with in these negotiations now. And that is something that I've heard quite a bit throughout the last 10 years, but also in discussions now that I had with people in KNU areas or in KIO areas, for instance, in recent days, where they were saying, well, at least there's some more streamlined negotiation channels now. And also people certainly, in EAOs have for a long time known that they have to negotiate with the Tatmadaw anyway, right? There's no way of negotiating something with the NLD and then the Tatmadaw is doing something else. Like even with the Tatmadaw, it's been complicated, right? There's been negotiations with the Tatmadaw in terms of the central command, and the frontline commands have done something else. So there's fragmentation there, of course, as well, right? So in a way, yes, it will simplify certainly some of the negotiations in terms of just channels of negotiations. And another maybe example for that is also when you look at, for instance, the Panglong Peace Fora, the actual negotiation fora, there's been about 1,800 delegates there, right? I mean, it's difficult to negotiate peace between two stakeholders already. And we've seen that in other, comparable maybe cases in the world as well. And in some places, indeed, there have been, arguments been made that one should be negotiating, only with one group after the other. For instance, when you look to Colombia and, negotiations with the FARC, etc. I mean, but besides all that, it's quite clear that obviously things might be easier in terms of just negotiation channels now. But that, of course, does not necessarily translate into a better outcome. Or into actually peace negotiations then, right? Because if you do look at what's happened before Daw San Suu Kyi came into power in 2016, and when you look at this period of U Thein Sein's administration, between 2011 and 2015 there, where clearly U Thein Sein was negotiating ceasefires with, for instance, the KNU, and then, initiating this nationwide ceasefire agreement, which was never nationwide, as we know. And indeed, only especially a few of the more powerful and stronger EAOs have signed up to it. But what happened there, of course, this was a very similar kind of extension to the ceasefire strategy and negotiations of the Tatmadaw with EAOs since the late 1980s. In terms of the content and the quality of these negotiations and what it was really about, not much has changed, right? In terms of those ceasefires, and including, I would argue, the NCA, despite some more lofty language around it, and those kind of previous ceasefires in the late 80s, 1990s, and all the problems that they had, right? And that's what I'm kind of trying to say. Yes, negotiations will be easier, but that does not mean that necessarily there'll be more kind of meaningful conversations, particularly with regards to the politics of the conflict that will be happening now.
What about within these EAOs, where you spent so much time getting to know the different people that are involved in politics within the EAOs? Will negotiating solely with the Tatmadaw shake things up in there regarding the legitimacy of leaders, of who you call rebels in your book? And maybe I was going to ask you later about why you use the word rebel to talk about these people.
Yeah, maybe we can clarify that first. It's an interesting one, actually. When I thought about the title and so on, I come to it from this kind of, say, mongrel perspective between area or Myanmar studies and conflict studies from a disciplinary perspective, right? And in a way, I hope the book can speak to both audiences, And like speaking to friends also within, the sphere of the KIO and the sphere of the KNU, right? I've been, of course, knowing that not everybody is appreciative of this tag rebel, especially, the older folks in some ways, right? But I've been here speaking especially also with people who are involved in the kind of civil society sphere of those groups, as well as researchers from Kachin, for instance. And again, it's really difficult because, especially now, I don't want to name any names, but some people would certainly know them. And throughout that, actually, kind of discussing what it might be best to call, those EAOs. EAO is, to be honest, a very technical term specific to Myanmar, and a very recent term indeed, right? So it kind of doesn't allow to speak to a broader phenomena on the one hand, and also really it doesn't quite historicize what's been going on in Myanmar. As a matter of fact, I think one could argue that the Tatmadaw could be called an EAO as well in some ways, right? Like the largest Burma-centric EAO in the country, just to show how kind of complicated some of the terminology goes here. Many of the movements call themselves, of course, also revolutionary movements, and I do speak about revolutionary movements quite a bit as well, but more when I look at the kind of social movement of theirs, the way that they kind of sort of stretch out in society more general, right? That, though, is not necessarily the best, I find, conceptual handle for the organizational aspects of these movements, because revolution is something, well, that's kind of going on in Yangon these days as well, right? People on the streets, etc., right? It doesn't quite depict the armed aspect as well as some of the guerrilla organizational aspect, aspects of the movements that we're looking at here, right? And so I know that you can't translate it with something like Tupon, for instance, in Burmese, of course, right? Because that's a very derogative term that is employed by the Tatmadaw to stress in many ways the illegitimate and violent nature of these groups, isn't it? But that is not, and I tried to be clear and clarify this in the introduction of the book, for instance, as well, that is not necessarily how rebel or rebellion or to rebel is used in English, right? And so we have to be clear that those concepts don't easily translate, right? And so through discussions also, many of my friends were actually very much agreeing that in English in particular, the idea of to rebel and the idea of a rebellion, and to rebel against injustice and so on is indeed a good handle to use here. And maybe just last word on that, even in the English language, right, or especially in kind of those fields of international studies, international relations and conflict studies and so on, right, like the terminology of rebellion has changed, or the connotation of it, right, was never such a bad thing necessarily, right? Like, I mean, to rebel against injustices and so on, like it has never been, necessarily, especially in the more sociologically inclined literatures, been bad thing in and of itself, right? It has more been the kind of discursive formation in conflict security studies that have linked rebellion with crime, and this kind of nexus that has come up and kind of depicted it as something inherently illegitimate to rebel against states and so on, because it's such a state-centric discipline, right? And sorts of depoliticize the cause of rebellion very often, that this has come about. So I hope also actually that the book can help to challenge some of that, more broadly. I mean, I remember also, I think Lee Jones's, with like discussions with him, where he was also obviously saying, well, it's good to foreground the political nature of rebellion, because quite honestly, in the political sciences, that's often not been seen anymore, right? And so in a way, I hope I can sort of achieve a little bit of both here, and with the caveat, of course, that neither that or many of the other terminologies won't straightforwardly translate into, Burmese, let alone Jingpo, or, many of the other languages, of course, as well, right?
Mm.
So it's a very interesting question to think about how the national change of politics will affect the fragmentation and politics and internal politics of EAOs, and how that then will again affect, negotiations or conflict dynamics between EAOs and the military. It's obviously from the outside, and I'm not there at the moment, difficult to say, but there's certainly a lot of movement now. And you can see this, for instance, and maybe let me focus here again on the KNU and the KAO in both of those cases. Let's start with the KAO. The KAO has released 2 statements by now, official statements that have been very diplomatic and try to be very firm at the same time. So it's tried to do this kind of tightrope walk about the coup. To appreciate, first of all, the KAO, of course, still is part of what is called this Northern Alliance of EAO groups, together with the WA, for instance, and the Arakan Army and the TNLA, for instance. So that Northern Alliance has until now been rather silent about, any of that in terms of, its diplomatic positioning. For the KAO, that hasn't quite worked in the same way, because in this might come back to my arguments in the book that the KAO has this really kind of embedded nature within like a large part, at least, of Kachin and especially Chingpo society, that it kind of needs to respond somewhat to the public in Kachin state, and especially as we've seen the rising tensions in Myitkyina, and including quite violent confrontations there between Tatmadaw soldiers and civilians. The KAO felt that, well, on the one hand, it might want to keep diplomatic silence on the politics of the coup and what that might mean, together with the Northern Alliance, because really it is, from a diplomatic perspective, maybe more strategic and clever to wait and see. And then also, though, responding to the kind of constituents of its in Kachin state, right? And what we've seen with the statement there, for instance, certainly also with the first statement, was that they were saying that the KIO will get involved or engaged if the Myanmar military is escalating violence against civilians, but it doesn't want to comment on the coup itself. And then get involved and engaged. I mean, that is, of course, something that, and I've heard that from Kachin friends also, is something that does exactly what it is meant to do. It provides moral support for people, for Kachin people, obviously, on the streets of Myitkyina, for instance. And at the same time, it doesn't commit itself to do anything necessarily, right? In terms of, you can't expect, I think, KIO soldiers showing up in Myitkyina anytime soon. So that is interesting in terms of, first of all, the really, I think, difficult positioning that needs to be done, or that is being done by EAOs at the moment, between those competing pressures, including the bottom-up pressures from their constituents. And this is certainly something that I go into depth in my book in terms of explaining how, in a way, power, legitimacy, authority, and really all of that sort of flows and works, not just from the top down here. And we look at the KNU, there's another thing that is happening that is interesting and that might speak to EAOs more generally as well. And that is this thing about fragmentation. And what you were saying in terms of how might different leaders reposition themselves within that now. There's been multiple statements from the KNU, which already shows us that there's multiple poles within the KNU. And the strongest statements, unsurprisingly, were coming from what is called, or what is calling themselves, the KNU Concerned Group, which is basically the group that is led by Nosipora Sane and Botiache, who's is the VCS, the Vice Chief of Staff of the KNLA, and has his stronghold in Mutro and the 5th Brigade areas, which is maybe the strongest in terms of military force within the KNLA. And they've been really the internal opposition to the leadership of the KNU that has been since 2012 negotiating the ceasefire, negotiating NCA provisions with U Thein Sein and then afterwards. And they've been always very concerned about this. So you see a different sorts of statements coming out of those different still factions within the movement. And the other thing, what I found interesting, maybe not super surprising, but it was certainly shocking for many Karen people, and I've seen a lot of comments on this, was that one of the previous KNU leaders, Mauning Maun, he defected to the junta, to the new junta, and was given a position there. And it's now been talked that he will indeed head the new peacemaking efforts of the junta. The interesting thing with Mauning Maun is he was called the Burmese Papillon because he fled from Coco Island, from this kind of high security prison in the Andaman Sea at some point. And it was very miraculous how he could flee in some ways, right? And returned to the KNU, was then, detained again on some international travel of him, etc. And returned to the KNU again. And I met him in, I think, 2000, must have been December in 2013. And he was very clear at the time to me that he certainly trusts the administration of U Thein Sein and their ceasefire efforts and peace efforts, and that the KNU should be going along with that in very clear ways. And you could see that both actually Mauning Maun and General Mutu Sepon, who's been one of the main leaders of the KNU throughout this period of transition, were really close with some of the Tatmadaw generals, including Min Aung Hlaing. There's many photos also between General Mutu Sepon and Min Aung Hlaing, for instance. And this is something that also I've been talking with them, including, and others, which is interesting to note, because on the one hand, of course, it kind of gets us into thinking about some of those cooptation dynamics that I've been describing in the book, yeah, and how those ceasefires are often very elitist deals that don't necessarily, deliver the politics of what people demand, or any other really opportunities for people lower down on the ranks, so especially local communities, etc. But also it speaks to another thing actually, and that is that there is a mutual respect between many EAO leaders and Tatmadaw generals, which we should not underestimate, who see themselves or each other as military people. And there's a mutual understanding in some ways, even though, of course, they're enemies, foes on the battlefield, etc., right? But there is this kind of mutual understanding and respect that hasn't always been the case between, especially the armed wing leaders of EAOs, and civilian politicians on, the Burma side, for instance. And that is certainly something that has been that I've been told quite a lot in terms of some of those relations there as well. But you can see in terms of summarizing up very quickly. So on the one hand, EAOs are caught between diplomatic cautiousness, and also maybe mid and long-term strategic thinking, and the need to respond to local constituents, at this present moment of heightened tension and violence. And at the same time, also, of course, how the reshuffling of national politics is, of course, having effects on the internal fragmentation within some movements, right? And the internal politics and reshuffling of power within them, which is something, I can only tell you what I've been seeing from the outside up until now, but which is something certainly to be watched, because quite clearly, I think, my book certainly shows, or I try to argue there at least, how these things are important to look at when we kind of then want to explain negotiation dynamics or conflict dynamics more widely.
It strikes me now that we haven't mentioned explicitly that the KNU is under a ceasefire at the moment, and the KIA or KIO is not, and that will also play a role. Something else that has happened in the last couple of weeks is that it appears the Tatmadaw is making a series of, grand strategic moves. For example, re-announcing the resumption of the Myitsone Dam, which used to be talked about all the time and has been sort of forgotten about recently. And then on a slightly smaller scale, they took over the Buga power plant.
The Buga power plant situation in Myitkyina, as far as I can understand, it's really still quite not clear what has indeed happened. I think it's to do with a few different things. So first of all, we have to maybe know, or our listeners also should be aware then, that Buga is a company that is basically owned by the KAO. I mean, it's striking, that Myitkyina and Waimo, so next to Myitkyina, is powered indeed by KAO power, even though it's government controlled, which has been one of the most interesting, I think, fascinating things really to discuss also in my book, why that might be, etc. And from the KAO side, it's clear. It's like, well, on the one hand, of course, it's revenue for us, but on the other hand, also it's legitimacy, right? And it's like we can't. I mean, obviously, these are our people. We of course, we're going to power Myitkyina, even though the enemies are ruling there. And I mean, it's fascinating in that regards, right? It's also fascinating in regards to like the whole politics of hydropower stations, because Buga is powered by hydropower, but much smaller hydropower than, of course, what is being proposed at Myitsone. Well, let's stay with Buga for a little second, for instance, further. So Buga, the thing what happened then, Myitkyina, from what I can understand from the outside, at the moment, is that the Tatmadaw has tried to force engineers back to work at, has tried to shut down the Buga power station, I think, to kind of control electricity provision, etc. Right, and local people have staged a protest, quite obviously being scared of what's happening, And this is where things escalated then, right? So I think that was really something where obviously a much more local, maybe rationale and logic has been driving that particular contestation than maybe an overarching strategy. I mean, that's at least my hinge, and I might well be wrong because obviously information at the moment is difficult, right? About those things. The mid-zone kind of announcing that mid-zone is going to be that the project, this mega dam at the confluence, that brings the Irrawaddy into being, or the Malika, as people say in Kachinpo, that certainly, to me, sounds like a more diplomatic move vis-a-vis China. The Chinese, I don't think, are very happy of what happened in terms of the coup. They were certainly not informed a long time beforehand, maybe a little bit of time beforehand. But the Chinese, like Beijing foreign policy, has basically had a good deal with Aung San Suu Kyi, right? If you look at many of those Belt and Road Initiative projects, many of them have been actually agreed to by Aung San Suu Kyi, and a lot of progress has been done in that regard. So Aung San Suu Kyi has one of the first kind of foreign policy things was to go to Beijing and assure the Chinese foreign policy establishment that things will run smoothly with her, and they did run smoothly with her, right? Whereas of course the Tatmadaw has a much more difficult relationship to China. We should not forget, of course, that this is on the one hand historically. I mean, the Chinese have supported the Communist Party in Burma, right? Communist Party of Burma, very directly with like Red Guards, and I mean that obviously, but also today, right? There's direct and indirect support to some of the EAOs, at least in the country. This is something that the Tatmadaw is, of course, very worried about. I think there's like re-announcing Mizon, is some form of, assuring also the Chinese foreign policy community now that there will be ongoing, pragmatic cooperative relations, etc., about especially those projects and so on. Whether or not that will actually lead to a restart of building that mega dam, I don't know. I obviously hope not. But if it did, that would certainly spark huge resistance, right? And not just from the Kachin people, but I think especially at this moment where there's this forming of at least some inter-ethnic solidarity movement, opposition in the country, etc., the Mizon dam resistance was where some of those inter-ethnic, movements have met before. Lau Keek has just published a really good article on exactly that, for instance, that I can recommend. So I think it'll be quite difficult to really necessarily restart that, especially given that the Tatmadaw has loads of things at their hands at the moment in terms of resistance in the country, right?
Right. Now, the last time that the Tatmadaw ignored a reasonably free and fair election 30 years ago, many people in the cities were furious. There was repression against the people in many urban areas and an exodus. Many refugees, Burma refugees, moved into areas controlled by ethnic armed organizations and rebels, which then re-energized the whole movement and created new ones, as we know. So we seem to be in an awkward period right now whereby that repression has not happened, but there are indications that it well could. If that were to happen, firstly, do you think it will, I suppose? If that were to happen, do you foresee a similar trajectory of a kind of migration and a reshuffling or re-energization of some of these movements? I suppose it would apply most to the KNU.
And that is, of course, because it's on the Thai border, and that makes it easy for, connecting up with other spaces in Chiang Mai, etc. We have to also, of course, I think, add there, right? And I agree that would apply mostly to the Thai border space then, right? just simply also for the reasons that the Chinese border space, is a very different kind, in terms of also what happens on the other side in Yunnan, in terms of mobilization and opportunities to, resist and form and so on, So I agree with you on that, absolutely. Let me think. So, I mean, obviously, first of all, whether there'll be an escalation of violent crackdowns, etc. Well, again, I hope obviously not. And when we look at history, what we see, of course, in '88, but also 2007, that the military took always quite some time to violently crack down, right? Indeed, when we look at history, it seems that there's something to come, and I can't really see at the moment a way out, and in those moments, in terms of those really tense moments, a way out is obviously what is important for either the military or also the whole resistance movement now, right? So I'm not unfortunately super optimistic that this whole thing won't spark much more violence than we've seen already. Obviously, I would hope that it does not. I do agree with you, that if that comes, or even already, we are seeing, remarkable changes and transformations in terms of moves, etc., between different parts of this, after all, quite fragmented opposition movement in Myanmar. And there is interesting historic parallels, obviously, when thinking about the kind of 88 generation and Burma demonstrators after 88 moving to Manaplo, the then headquarters of the KNU, and then from there further to the Thai border area, and the whole kind of opposition nexus that has come together at this border space between Burma activists, between ethnic minority resistance movements, and so on. And that was, I think, certainly a time, and not all was just great about all of that space, right? It was often very aid dependent, for instance, and you had all of that, right? So but still, like, there was something remarkable about this, I think, rather progressive inter-ethnic solidarity that was found in the 90s and then also later on in the 2000s, and that has in a way suffered in those years in this decade of transition, and not least because of that aid dependent nature of some of the organizations, and that aid kind of shifting wholesale from the border to inside Myanmar, where some of that aid has ended up in militarized bureaucracies, including the Ministry of Border Affairs, etc., and supporting kind of counterinsurgency, certainly not knowing and so on. But, that is part of the story. Part of the aid also, of course, has, gone to this very vibrant civil society within Myanmar now, right? Including, for instance, the LGBT community and so on. So, I mean, there's been, a lot of remarkable things happening in this decade. But also, I think we've seen that this particular radical progressive inter-ethnic solidarity that has happened after the 1990s has somehow suffered through that. And I do believe that what we can observe now, that there is at least indications that we can see more of that again, and that we can see, an actual, coming back to some of this, including, of course, what you just said, the whole, the whole movement of Burmese activists, etc., people who have to hide and have to flee, through the kind of liberated areas of ethnic armed resistance movements to the Thai border and so on, which hasn't started on a big scale yet, but it has indeed, I think, I know that some individuals and so on have already been having to look for safety that way, and so there's certainly that possibility, absolutely. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's born out of a really dire situation, obviously. But in terms of how it could, link up some of those important nodes of opposition to a much more nationwide movement, at least can be contributive to that.
You mentioned earlier the Northern Alliance, which the KIA is a member of, and actually not all of the armies in the Northern Alliance are in the north. One of the big ones is the Arakan Army, which has made a lot of waves in Myanmar in recent years. So what's the role of this alliance and other alliances in the peace process and in EAO politics? And how do you see that changing or affecting the future?
Yeah, this is an important question because it comes back to, I think, a lot of debates also these days that I can see on the social media sphere about potential unification of EAOs in some form of kind of unified front approach, etc., against the Tatmadaw. Like the Myanmar Times has just published something on a unified Shan movement, for instance, etc., which quite obviously would be, an historic novum, and no mean feat, I think, as Lee Jones was commenting as well, that the Tatmadaw would achieve unity amongst Shan armed groups in Shan state. And so I think there's clearly a lot of hope being placed that there will be more unity and, a stronger alliance movement between EAOs now. Again, of course, understandably so. Looking to history, some of that might play out a bit more fragmented in a more complicated way. And I come back to AA. I think that's a really important question. But first of all, some of the statements that we've seen for EAO unity were coming not least from EAO leaders themselves. So, for instance, General Mutu Sepo, who I mentioned earlier, who's been the chairman and one of the main leaders of the KNU for a long time, but especially for the last decade in terms of negotiations and kind of actual power in the KNU, etc. He's released statements about the need for EAOs to be unified against the Tatmadaw, etc. Well, so now he was the same leader who took the KNU out of the UNFC alliance, which was an alliance based in Chiang Mai and that comprised of different groups, including the KIO and the KNU, before that Northern Alliance came about. And he was basically the man behind disassembling that alliance at some point, because he very much knew that U Thein Sein and his kind of negotiation partners on the Tatmadaw side did not quite like to see that alliance. Plus, of course, that this alliance included non-NCA members like the KIO, and tried to also pull the KNU to the other side again, right? He was also the same person who has gone against other unity ideas amongst Karen movements. Ideas that were floated at some point to have some form of Karen armed forces that would bridge, the KNU and some of the other armed groups, Karen armed groups in Karen state. And so we first of all, have to think, okay, who's making some of those statements and how credible might they be, given, their own histories. The other thing, though, in terms of the AA and maybe to hone into the Northern Alliance, the Northern Alliance clearly is a strong alliance in terms of its military capability. It comprises of, militarily, the strongest movements of the country. And we've seen, some of that playing out in the last years. The AA is part of the Northern Alliance, first of all, maybe, and that might be a bit, confusing because they've mobilized in the North, in particular, since 2008. And I met their leaders in 2014 on the Chinese border, basically, right? And they since have moved back to Rakhine. And partly why the fighting in Rakhine has been so heavy is, of course, because the Arakan army has not had territory under control, right? So it's a very different kind of combat, if you think so, than the mostly defensive combat than other EAOs have to defend their pockets of territory from the Tatmadaw, because the AA had to wrestle off territory from the Tatmadaw. So it was a very offensive campaign on the side of the EAO here in terms of the AA, right? And also, of course, we shouldn't forget that the AA has a lot of strong public support in northern Rakhine and amongst Arakanese people in particular, right? And I think that's, also for the fact that many Arakanese people have felt that they've not been listened to by the West, that their grievances haven't been taken into account in many of the debates surrounding, conflicts in Rakhine, etc. And that they didn't necessarily have the same outlets, maybe, for their grievances, like in other places, in terms of civil society organizations that were supported by Western donors, etc. So in a way, you can see how that has kind of radicalized, and therefore increase the support to the actual EAO military movement. And that has certainly made the AA one of the most strongest and capable fighting forces in the country, right? That has grown incredibly in terms of numbers over the last years. And that also, I think, makes it important to watch that space now, to come back to that. This is because you can clearly see that the Tatmadaw is trying to, pacify now the Western Front with the AA, to, first of all, concentrate its forces in terms of, suppressing resistance all over the rest of the country, including, of course, in Yangon, Mandalay, etc. But also, at the same time, we've seen quite a lot of fighting in Shan State. We've seen, nude fighting in northern Karen State. Well, it's been there for it's been going on for a long time, but these campaigns haven't ceased, right? So in a way, you can see that at the moment, the Tatmadaw is trying to pacify the Western Front as it has with a ceasefire with the Arakan Army, as it has pacified, the Eastern Front before to concentrate on the North, for instance. It's this kind of very, very old, long-going strategy. We have to watch that space because if the Arakan Army were to sign a ceasefire, that would, of course, be quite disastrous for the EAO movement strategies more generally. I think that they also have competing pressures there, right? For instance, a ceasefire would enable them to fortify their actual political control of some of the places in northern Rakhine State. So it would strategically make a lot of sense, actually, for them, in terms of their own project. And at the same time, of course, there's competing pressures from the Northern Alliance, who would, certainly not want to see the Arakan Army signing a ceasefire at a moment like this. But anyway, so this whole alliance thing, etc., is a space to watch, and at the same time, the kind of often celebration of some new form of unity amongst EAOs, I think, is a little premature for the moment.
Okay, and if we want to keep an eye on this, where should we look? The media landscape is kind of changing a little bit in Myanmar at the moment. If we want to keep abreast of the EAO politics in the country, do you have any suggestions about where to keep tabs on?
I mean, there is really good, obviously, ethnic minority placed news outlets, right? That, I mean, are really important and great. And I mean, obviously, I've been following things like Karen News or Kachin News Group or Shan Herald, for instance. I mean, these are just a few to be named, but actually I've seen there was this map on Twitter. So Twitter is a great place at the moment because a lot of also Burmese people have joined Twitter and so on. You must have seen, right? And there was a map, actually. Let me try and find that. I just found that map. If you look at Twitter and look at Winnie Thaw, so that is at THAW and then another W, INNIE. She's just been tweeting about a map of private local media in Myanmar's ethnic states and regions. And I can just see there's about 2-3 dozen different ones, from, for instance, the Chin Channel to the Kachin Waves or for instance, the Mon News Agency, of course, which is a long-standing one, etc. Right? So obviously, right, such a vast country, such a diverse country, etc., that I wouldn't necessarily know about all of those myself, but they exist, and I've been following the ones that are close to my own areas of research there, right? And they're obviously very important. So, if you can, well, it's places worth of support,
Yeah. And what about opening that up for wider recommendations? I always finish the episodes by asking our guests to recommend something to do with Myanmar. It can be to do with your particular interest, or it can be anything else that you think is of importance right now, given the dynamic situation in the country. So, David, would you like to recommend anything to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, to follow up from that very question, I think one of the most important forces for resisting what is happening at the moment, is credible information in the country, and to retain that, because we've seen, of course, the kind of forceful direct attacks on journalists across the country. And I think also following the Twitter sphere, and with a lot of people joining Twitter also from within Myanmar at the moment, the force of misinformation also is really strong, right? And it's dangerous. So one of the things I've been following is this claim that there's Chinese soldiers on the streets now. It doesn't make any sense really from the Tatmadaws perspective, neither does it from the Chinese perspective. I mean, surely the Chinese are going to support whoever is in power in Myanmar, right? But really to send Chinese soldiers doesn't make much sense. And, claims like that are often based on how soldiers look in terms of their skin color or ethnic appearance, etc., or that they don't speak Burmese. And that, of course, shows in many ways that, well, a lot of people aren't familiar so much with the diversity of the country, really, right? And it's a bit sad, after all. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that this misinformation, is obviously dangerous. Here, for instance, for the Chinese community, the Chinese ethnic community in Myanmar, we've seen, for instance, already statements, by the Youth Association of Chinese Myanmar people out that was kind of very much telling people that they're supporting, the civil disobedience movement, the resistance to the coup, and so on, and also that they are quite afraid, right? Because we know very much how misinformation and so on can turn lethal, also, right? And in that sense, of course, that misinformation is first of all supporting the Tatmadaw, isn't it? It's first of all supporting, a kind of deflection from where we should put the blame at, which is Mina Online and it's like generals, basically, right? And in that sense, also, again, I think sort of supporting, information in Myanmar is incredibly important and will be even more important now. I know that, for instance, Frontier Myanmar, which I think is a great outlet, and others have, of course, on the websites ways for you to actually support, them in terms of donations as well, right, through PayPal and other places. And you can do this also with some of the outlets from ethnic minority areas. And I believe that this is hugely important. And, if you can, surely that will help.
Yeah, and right now you could characterize what's happening on the streets of Yangon, at least, as an information battleground. That is what's going on, and it's not over. That's a really good recommendation supporting quality journalism in Myanmar, so thank you for that. This has been an excellent chat, David, and the first one about the momentous events earlier this month. So thank you so much for coming on Myanmar Musings.
Thanks very much, Luke, for having me. It was great actually to reflect on what is happening now, also through that, maybe less common lens, in particular of the border areas, ethnic minorities, ethnic politics, and EAO politics. Yeah, thank you.